Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Sam Corey. Tia, how you doing on this day? It's Wednesday.
Hump day. Doing pretty well. The weather's trending upwards. So by the end of the week, we're going to see really, really beautiful weather again. So we're going up.
You going outside? You walking at all?
Outside? Am I going outside? I'll be washing my vehicle too. Have to. My parents told me I have to. But what's on the show today?
Oh man, we got a lot of great things on the show today. We got a new exhibit that's coming to the Hamtramck Historical Museum, exploring the contributions of Bangladeshi Americans. Really excited about that. But first, what will be the future of our state's economy, and how are we going to shape it? Michigan-based automotive companies Ford, GM, and Stellantis are going electric. That's just part of the electrification happening as our grid shifts because of climate change. But it's a particularly big deal for the auto industry and for Michigan's economic future. But not everybody wants that future. Just over 50% of Michiganders believe the state should be a leader in EV manufacturing. Mostly Democrats make up that number, while a large percentage of independents and Republicans believe we shouldn't make the transition at all. That's according to recent polling from the Detroit Regional Chamber and the Glenn Gariff Group in Lansing. Why is this? And can there be anything done to bring more people along philosophically and practically into our changing economy? To discuss this now, we have Richard Chuba here. He is the president of the Glenn Gariff Group. Richard, welcome to the Metro.
Hey, good morning. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I want to start by playing this clip of Republican Mike Rogers, who was debating Alyssa Slotkin as he was vying for the Senate seat the other night.
What a candidate says and what they do when they're in office for the last 5 years, really, really important. Voted for the EV mandate at least 3 times. And as soon as about 4 weeks ago, doubled down on her position on EV mandates. I'm telling you, it is ruining our car industry.
So that was Mike Rogers speaking out against the transition to electric vehicles. First, to your knowledge, why has this narrative been pushed by Republicans? Why do they think this is a bad idea?
Well, one thing that we know in this election is Donald Trump is particularly good. One of his skills is understanding people's concerns, where they have angst, and driving a wedge into it even further. And I think what we're seeing here is that taking place. Michiganders are concerned about the transition to electric vehicles. And I want to separate out. We've asked separate questions on, would you buy an EV? Do you want one? We know the answer's there. What this survey did with the chamber was we wanted to look specifically at the jobs that come with the auto industry.
I want to stop you there for a second, Richard. Would people buy an EV? Would most people, if they could afford it, would they buy an EV?
Democrats would. And what we're seeing is a sharp partisan divide here between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans aren't interested. Democrats, much more interested. And there's also a big age component to it, where voters under 40 are far more open to electric vehicles than voters over 40. And that's part of because it's what we know. It's, people get used to certain things and they don't want to give them up. So, as we talk about this, it's important to separate out this idea of, are you interested in buying one versus should we fight for these jobs?
Yeah. So I want to, step back here and sort of reset. I'm wondering why you think Mike Rogers is wrong. You and the Detroit Regional Chamber, along with other leaders in Michigan, leaders in the car industry and politicians, believe, at least some politicians, believe it's really important that Michigan makes this transition to electric vehicles and particularly is a leader in this space. Why is that the case?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to argue whether or not we should or shouldn't transition to EVs. I did the polling to understand where voters feel about that. But there is a legitimate question to be asked of, it's not just the American auto industry making the transition. The entire worldwide auto industry is making this transition. And Sandy Barua, who heads the Detroit Chamber, makes a really compelling point that in the 1970s, the American automobile industry was in a similar position where everybody disregarded, Japanese competition, smaller cars, nobody's going to want to buy a smaller car. And sure enough, that was a galvanizing moment in the automobile industry, and we're facing a similar one now worldwide. It's not just in Michigan or America, it's worldwide. And are we going to keep up with that new moment in the automobile industry to make sure Michigan is the epicenter, or it continues to be the epicenter for the automobile industry?
And so to your knowledge, to your information based on your polling, are there any kind of Republicans or independents around the state that believe we should make this shift? And I'm wondering what kind of, Republicans or independent voters they are. What has sort of brought them along into the fold, if they exist?
Well, first of all, we asked this question: should Michigan compete to be the center of EV manufacturing? And by a margin of 50 to 45, Michigan voters are relatively split. 50% say yes, 45% say no. To give everyone a sense of what that looks like by party, 80% of Democrats say yes. Only 33% of independents, only 25% of Republicans say yes. So there's a huge partisan split. 1 in 4 Republicans say yes. They tend to be college-educated Republicans, and what I would frankly call the old traditional Republican. And they tend to be younger Republicans also.
Okay, so part of the older part of the party, and then also college-educated Republicans are more on board.
Right, but we also know that there's a mammoth realignment that's underway between the parties, where there was a day where college-educated voters were primarily Republican. Now college-educated voters are primarily Democratic. So there's that shift taking place there. One of the interesting things we see on this question is just how much rural voters are not on board with the shift to EV manufacturing. And to give you a sense of that, in Metro Detroit, that is Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, and the bigger counties around it, they believe Michigan should compete by a margin of 62 to 35. But in outstate areas, and we call outstate everything else in Michigan, it's 40 to 54. And so one of the interesting things here is only 30% of rural voters think Michigan should compete with for these jobs. And that's a really interesting position given the degree to which rural voters are, to a much greater extent, non-college voters that rely on these kinds of jobs for employment.
Right. So by and large, rural voters are against this transition, and more urban ones are for it.
That's exactly correct. And particularly we see this divide between the Detroit area, which is, the home of the automobile industry, and the rest of the state.
Yeah. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Richard Chuba. He runs a polling company that just asked how Michiganders are feeling about being a leader in manufacturing electric vehicles. The short summary of that is Democratic voters in the state are mostly for it, and Republican voters are mostly against it.
So, Richard, though it's been a slow move to transition to EVs, the EV market share is up to 9% in 2020, and GM sold 32,000 EVs last quarter, making it the number 2 EV seller in the U.S. So how much does it matter that Republicans and Republican voters are against the transition? Is this happening whether some people like it or not, or will their concerns sincerely slow this economic transition down?
Well, we asked this question. We asked a very similar question to what you just said. This is how many EVs are sold. Do you think EVs are going to increase over the next few years, or decrease, or not change? And what's really interesting here is 70% of Democrats think sales are going to increase, but only 30% of Republicans think they will increase. So there's this disconnect going on politically about what's actually happening in the auto industry, why the transition is being made. Americans love to think of themselves as the center of everything. I mean, that's just a fact of polling.
Yeah.
But this is a worldwide shift taking place. And, if our automakers want to compete worldwide, they have to make the shift along with the rest of the world here, whether or not Americans are buying them or not.
Yeah.
And so that becomes really an important element to all of this. Should Michigan's automakers compete or not?
Yeah.
And I will point out politically, this isn't a conversation we're hearing in places where there are Tesla workers, in Georgia, in South Carolina. They're not having these conversations. They want these jobs. It's only here in Michigan that we're having the conversation of, oh, we don't want those EV or battery plant jobs. And that's really an interesting point. This is only going on in Michigan right now.
Well, to your understanding, why is that the case? I mean, there's certainly, are there not, I guess, political leaders in those states who are pushing back against the transition like there are in our state here?
Well, I think we have to be very realistic politically that Donald Trump is leading this conversation against electric vehicles. And in Michigan, a lot of the Republicans are lining up behind him. We don't see, for example, Donald Trump saying to his largest donor, Elon Musk, and his workers, you shouldn't have these jobs. But he came up to Flint and told Michigan's auto workers, you can't compete with China, and we shouldn't even be doing it. I think it's important for Michiganders to understand that difference, that the issue is frankly being used against them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting geographical distinction.
Right. The question is Michigan willing to, allow these short-term political gains for really long-term economic losses?
Yeah. I want to now play a clip of Alyssa Slotkin, a congresswoman and Democrat, debating Mike Rogers the other night.
I don't care what kind of car you want to drive. I don't drive an EV. I live on a dirt road, on a farm. That's not likely in my future. But if the fundamental question is who do we want to make that next generation of vehicles, you better believe I want that to be Michigan and not China.
So there, Slotkin is making a pragmatic business case that contrasts with Trump. Do you think this is an effective message in trying to convince Michiganders, maybe particularly rural Michiganders, independent voters in the state, that this transition to electric vehicles is an important one?
Well, I think it was a smart pivot for Alyssa Slotkin. But people are, really emotional on the electric vehicle issue because they don't want one. And, politically, what's being charged is she's mandating everybody buy an electric vehicle. And I think it's taken Democrats a while to respond to that charge. So for them, they need to respond to it. And the way to respond to it is we're not telling anybody what kind of car they should buy. But I think what's missing in this conversation is what we just talked about, which is it's about more than just what kind of car you're buying. It's what kind of cars are being bought around the world. What every other automaker is doing and transitioning. People buy Teslas in Michigan. Nobody's being told a Tesla is bad. And yet they're being told General Motors, Ford, Stellantis shouldn't be building these.
Yeah. So it's a changing of the messaging and it's sort of getting on board to where the rest of the globe is going. Richard Chuba, president of the Glenn Gariff Group, a Lansing polling firm, just did this recent polling. Richard, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
The Metro on 1019 WDET FM. You just heard from Sam Corey. I'm Tia Graham. And coming up, there are tens of thousands of people waiting to get housing vouchers in the state. We'll talk about why that is and what's being done to change it. Stay right there. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Sam Corey. What's going on, Tia?
It's going on. It's Wednesday once again. Super excited about having you across from me from the mic. And I'm just excited about the conversations that we have coming up on the show, left on the show at least. This one right now is one that's really interesting to me. Housing costs continue to rise in the U.S., and it is a problem that hits home in the Minton and Detroit. It's been nearly a year since the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, or MSHDA, has moved anyone off the wait list for federal housing choice vouchers, a program that caps a person's rent at 30% of their income. And the big news here, 85,000 people are on MSHDA's wait list.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people, Sam.
Wow.
To discuss this further, we're joined by Nushrat Rahman, a reporter for the Free Press and BridgeDetroit. Nushrat, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I love following your work. You're a great reporter. So can you explain what the MSHDA Federal Housing Choice Voucher is and how it's intended to help people with housing?
Yeah, I mean, it's really regarded as a lifeline for low-income families who are struggling to put a roof over their head. It exists across the country. And in Michigan, the Michigan State Housing Development Authority is the largest distributor of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Most people may know it as Section 8, which is what it was formerly called. And it essentially caps rent at about 30% of a family's income. And so the program pays for a certain portion of it, and the family is responsible for the other portion of it. So as you can imagine, it's a big relief for families. But I mean, historically, it's been very difficult to get into this program anyways. And now we have this additional barrier where, people aren't being pulled off of this wait list, which has tens of thousands of people on it in Michigan alone.
And just thinking about the 85,000 people in the state of Michigan, why haven't people been taken off of the list in almost a year?
I mean, like I said, this program it's a program that a lot of people want to get into, and the demand far exceeds the availability, right? I mean, that's a major problem that we have in this program and in other programs across the country. I mean, the wait list is years. Like, you could be on the wait list for anywhere from like a few months to a few years. And so getting into it is very difficult anyways for several reasons. Like I mentioned, the demand and the supply. But now it's being made worse because of rising housing costs in Michigan. It's not really meeting up to the demand that exists. And so we have the squeeze, and families are kind of caught in the middle.
And Nushrat, can you talk about how this is also impacting the Detroit Housing Commission wait list? I know that's another one that's really long, and it takes a while to get through with them. So what's going on there?
Yeah, and so it's a similar issue over at the Detroit Housing Commission, which is another distributor of the Housing Choice Voucher Program. There are about 3,000 people on that wait list alone. And so what that means is that they have stopped issuing new Housing Choice Voucher subsidies through that specific program. Now, I will mention that other programs are currently available and operating, and so those are project-based vouchers, and so that's a little bit different. It means that there are specific units that are designated, whereas with the Housing Choice Voucher, you can choose where you want to live. And between both programs, the MSHDA one and the Detroit Housing Commission program, what I will say is that although that there are lots of applicants who are currently on the wait list, the people that currently have a voucher will not be affected. So that's a pretty important distinction that we do want to make, that there are tens of thousands of people on the wait list, but the ones that do have a voucher, they're not going to see a change.
Good.
Nushrat, you cover people who are housing insecure in Detroit and Southeast Michigan, and you also cover folks who are homeless. I'm wondering what this looks like for them. Are they, teetering even further? What kind of cuts do they have to make in their life to make ends meet? What does this look like on the ground for people?
Yeah, I mean, here's what I will say. So we know that 85,000 people are on the, wait list for MSHDA's program. About 6% of them are people who are experiencing homelessness. What MSHDA has said are that these are the families that are impacted the hardest. Often what we saw previously was that homeless residents are kind of pushed to the top and they're able to get the housing, but that has changed because of this pause. And so not only are families that maybe are already, that may not be homeless, they were trying to get onto the list, but there are also people who are homeless who are trying to get onto the list. Now no one can get into it. And so what we do do have is that people who are kind of languishing in shelters, people who are out on the streets who maybe have their name on the list, I mean, they don't really have an option to get into Section 8 housing. There are other programs available, but again, it all goes back to demand and supply. There are very limited options for folks out there. And so we see that people who are facing housing instability, people who are out on the streets, who are in shelters, are going to be hit the hardest with this pause.
And so we've seen that number rise. Are there more homeless individuals because of this?
I don't know that we can say that, make that correlation. We just do know that the number of people who are experiencing homelessness that are on the list is about 6%. So of the 85,000, about 5,000 across the state are experiencing homelessness.
If you're just joining us, we're talking with Nushrat Rahman. She's a reporter for the Free Press and Bridge. We're talking about the MSHDA housing program and some of the changes that we're seeing right now in the state. And Nushrat, what have people said needs to change in order to make this a little bit easier for residents in the state?
Yeah, so I did get a chance to talk to the principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And I chatted with him a little bit about, hey, what's going on here, right? And what he told me is that it's costing more per voucher, which means that it's putting a bigger strain on the funding that HUD gets from the government. And so he was basically saying that across the country, housing agencies are using 100% of the funding that they get for Congress for this program. But the issue is that, the U.S. needs to build more housing and to ramp up rental assistance. There just isn't enough rental housing. There isn't enough supply to meet up with the demand, and the housing costs are rising. So you have this big stew of issues that are all coming together, and it's like a pressure cooker. And the families that are most vulnerable are those who are low income, those who are experiencing homelessness.
You took the words out. I think Sam and myself, we were literally going to say the same thing. It's like this melting pot of just issues that are compounding together and creating a much larger issue that we're seeing in the state right now. So Nushrat, what steps has the city of Detroit taken to improve affordable housing?
Yeah, and the city of Detroit has been announcing, housing development after housing development. We get the press releases often. But one of the more interesting plans that the mayor and city council members have pitched is this plan to speed up affordable housing in the city. And it's basically this ordinance that would offer property tax cuts to developers based on their rent prices. So in summary, the more affordable the units, the deeper the tax reduction that the developer can see, as long as, they keep the prices reduced for several years and it shrinks the approval time. So essentially, it boils down to a more streamlined process for affordable housing developers to build affordable housing in the city. Because that's one of the main barriers that a lot of developers have mentioned, is that it's really hard for us to build affordable housing because we don't get anything out of it. And it's just like a very difficult process. And so one developer even called it a game changer. I will say that this has not been, it still needs to get city council approval and things like that. But it is a plan that was pitched by the city and city officials to kind of ramp up the availability of affordable housing. But again, this is a timeline, right? So it's going to take some time. And in the meantime, we do know that housing choice vouchers are still paused.
Yeah, and we spoke on the show with Councilmember Fred Durhal about that program. It seems like an interesting one. Nushrat, I want to ask you, I just wonder if this story sort of confirms the idea that homelessness is a housing problem. And when I say that, I mean to say that there's a lot of ideas about what causes homelessness, of what causes housing insecurity. Some people think it's drug abuse and drug addiction. Some people think it's mental illness. But there's this other idea that, listen, it's really just simply about supply. You either have it or you don't. People either have access to it or they don't. And if they don't, then they're not going to have it. And it's as simple as that. I'm wondering what you make of that idea.
Yeah, I think you're right. Of all the experts, I've been covering housing affordability, housing and homelessness for about 4 years here in Detroit. And of all the experts and families that I've talked to, it always comes down to housing, right? That is the root issue about homelessness. There are a number of factors that we can point to as well, whether it's mental health issues, drug issues, et cetera. There are a host of problems that can be tied back to homelessness. But one of the primary ones is the availability of housing, and not just any type of housing that's affordable for people who don't have any incomes, who have very low income, or who are struggling to get a job, because it is very difficult for people to find and keep a job, especially making enough money where they can afford rent, whether it's in Detroit or in Metro Detroit. So, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It does boil down to but I will say, last year we did a story where we followed a woman who, as she exited out of homelessness, she was homeless for the first time. And even after she got, she actually ended up getting a Section 8 voucher. Even after she got a home, she still struggled because she couldn't find a job. It was very difficult for her. So I will say that, yes, with the caveat that it's still, even when you do have a home, it can be really difficult because it's a combination of multiple things, right? Like having a steady income, et cetera. So, yeah.
Nushrat Rahman, we could talk to you all day about this, actually.
So true.
Reporter for
So
the Detroit
true.
Free Press, reporter for Bridge Detroit. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. We will definitely have you back.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. Now, while the voucher program is frozen, MSHDA refers people facing homelessness or housing insecurity to alternative agencies, programs, and services across the state. The MSHDA Housing Assessment and Resource Agency contact list can be found on their website. Now, Sam, taking a quick look at the weather forecast today.
Yeah.
Sunny with a high near 54 degrees.
54, that's low. We're dipping. We're starting to dip.
No, this is an increase happening. Thursday, sunny with a high near 61
There it
degrees.
goes.
Friday, sunny with a high near 64. There's no dip. This is going up, 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 and I'm excited about that.
Me too. Also in the news, Oakland County voters will decide whether to approve a new millage to improve and expand parks. The 20-year levy would add about $40 a year to an average property tax bill. It would generate about $52 million annually. Oakland County Parks Director Chris Ward says residents will notice many capital improvements at county parks if voters approve the millage.
Love talking about parks.
Love talking about parks.
Coming up, women are now leaders in the music industry. We'll hear about how that happened from WDET's Ann DeLisi. Stay right there. It's the Metro on 1019 WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham. Sam?
And I'm here with you, Tia.
I was going to say, Sam, are you here?
I am here.
Oh,
I am
you had
so
enough
here.
coffee?
I've had plenty of coffee. I'm doing great this morning.
Alrighty then. I was going to say, I'm the Energizer Bunny this morning.
That's right.
Alrighty then. Well, nowadays, I think about the music industry, and I'm super excited because women are on top of the music game. You got T-Swizzle, Taylor Swift. You got Beyonce. You got Megan Thee Stallion, Billie Eilish. The list goes on and on. Olivia Rodrigo. So many amazing, powerful women right now. You can pick your favorite. Doesn't matter. But it wasn't always like that. And a new book from NPR called How Women Made Music, A Revolutionary History, pulls from 50 years of NPR interviews celebrating the challenges and triumphs of women in the music industry. And tonight, WDET's Ann DeLisi will be part of a panel discussion on that book. She spoke with WDET's Ryan Patrick Hooper about this and more on his show In the Groove.
So it's going to be a discussion about how women made their mark in music, and they've basically had so many contributors to NPR throughout the years, and this is sort of a compilation of all of that. Then they've got their best 200 albums in the back. Don't you always love looking at say they have the 150 greatest albums made by women. That's in here.
I definitely want to flip through that.
And then they say the 200 greatest songs by women in the 20th century. So there's those two. And then we always look through there and go, I agree with that. I agree with that. And inevitably you're like, I don't know that would have made it. Would I put that one on there? And then the ones you missed. You never win on a list like that. But it is fascinating to consider what all these contributions from women in music have done. And so we're going to be up there, all of us talking about this book and women in music. And, inside the book in the foreword, they talk about the fact that Joan Baez is in here talking about nonviolence as a musical principle back in 1971, talking about Dolly Parton and her favorite song and the personal story behind it. Nina Simone explaining how she developed the edge in her voice as a voice against racism. Then Taylor Swift talking about how she didn't know if her career would ever be a career.
I love that it is multi-generational like that, though, because you have these icons from the past, and they're saying, yes, this is 50 years of history of NPR's coverage of women in music, but they're not neglecting the fact that these conversations, these discussions, these influences are still happening. There's new artists that are pushing the boundaries.
No question. You're absolutely right. And so, they cover the gamut. The music is all over the place, and that's what makes it exciting, and that women have been performing and writing music in these genres for years. They've got guitar players in here. We forget there's some kick-ass guitarists out there, and they are in the hands of a woman, And so to be able to sit up there and talk with people about, as you said, women's history, and we're talking about a vast history. There's Terry Lynn Carrington, the jazz drummer, who has a piece in here as well, and talking about where they were at certain moments when they were making albums and when they were writing songs, and how that played out in the public space. And I've always said, when I started in radio, if you were listening to rock radio, there was Hart and Pat Benatar and Janis Joplin and not much else.
A limited pool.
There was a limited pool when it came. And I remember seeing Pat Benatar at the Punch and Judy Theater. And then the next time I saw her, she had sold out Pine Knob. And so just watching these women sort of get in that space. And, we can't neglect Sarah McLachlan's impact with Lilith Fair. It's lasting impact, because at that point in time, you didn't have as many women on the radio. You didn't have as many women making music that was getting recorded and released. And that helped to change all of it. It definitely, got the scales a little more even at that time. And it was really exciting to watch. But I remember her talking about the press conferences at that time, and they were cringeworthy at best. The most inappropriate questions you could ever imagine were being asked of her. And they would say to her, why do you keep doing these press conferences? And she's like, I'm going out there every single time, and I'm going to field all these stupid questions as well as the good ones. So it was an interesting time.
What have you seen change? What's been your perspective as a radio host?
I do remember that at one point you couldn't play two female artists back to back on the radio.
Really?
It was a rule, because there just wasn't enough of them. And then that all changed, as more women started making music. What's changed is you see the power of a female artist, and Beyonce and Taylor Swift are the most obvious choices. Or examples of that, I should say, because of the revenue that they've generated in every city they go to. I mean, when you have the president of a country calling Taylor Swift to say, come to our country, come to our town, because it'll make such a big difference, that is pretty unbelievable. And the way these two artists in particular deal with their fans has been a fascinating thing to watch. Now, Taylor Swift, a friend of mine used to work for MCA Country, and she was with Rascal Flatts. And Taylor Swift was the opening act for Rascal Flatts. And my friend said after every show, Taylor Swift would write a handwritten note to everyone that was at the meet and greet. Wow. And she started, you could tell then that she was starting to develop how to connect with her fans when she was a young artist just figuring out how to do this. And now she has basically written the book on how do you connect with your audience in such a profound way and stay top of mind, because we know that music comes and goes a lot faster than it used to. If you have 60,000 tracks going onto Spotify a day and you're exposed to more music than ever, to be able to stay top of mind and develop that much loyalty is an amazing thing in this day and age. It used to be people would just love an artist, and no matter what they put out, you would go buy their album the day it came out. It was just, that's what you would do. Well, being able to have that kind of longevity now, I think, is a tall order. And to have the, women artists in particular showing how that's done on such a grand scale is exciting to watch.
That was Ryan Patrick Hooper speaking with Ann DeLisi. Ann is hosting a panel discussion on women and music tonight at 6 p.m. at Third Man Records in Detroit's Cass Corridor, right down the street from WDET. Tickets are available at the door.
And, Sam, what I love so much about that is that women in music truly growing up. I, for myself, been following Beyonce since Destiny's Child. So I've been able to have Beyonce in my life since like grade school all the way up to now. And she's been able to, we've been able to develop and grow with her. And I think about the young women who started with Taylor when they were young, first, second grade, and now they're adults like Sophia, who is one of our digital editors here. She grew up with that. So it's just like to have that longevity, especially women artists, especially powerful women, amazing to do. Amazing.
That relationship with the artist over time, to watch them grow and change, that's really beautiful.
It's amazing to see, once again, lady power. I love that.
And most of the artists I listen to are women. They just are. I mean, there's so many incredible artists. They're great. Listen, they're great male artists too. I'm not, taking anything away from them, but many, many, many great female artists.
Yes, and transition here. Speaking of sports,
where there are other great performers.
Yes, exactly.
The Pistons wrap up the NBA season against the Cleveland Cavaliers tonight at Little Caesars Arena. The game starts at 7 p.m.
Fingers crossed on that one.
And the season as a whole.
I know.
And
man. The Lions have signed defensive lineman Aleem McNeil to a 4-year contract extension. He's made 8 tackles this season and is credited with 2.5 quarterback sacks, which is great. I watched one of those not too long ago. And the Lions have scored. This is a fun fact about the Lions. The Lions have scored 89 points over their last 2 games. That's the most in franchise history since 1962. They head to Minnesota to take on the Vikings this Sunday. 1962. I think my dad was young, a baby still.
My dad was about 5.
You know what I mean?
He was 5 years old.
Wow.
And they're playing Minnesota this weekend. I mean, that is going to be quite the game. Minnesota looks fierce these days.
Come on now. We're the Lions.
All right.
I
I can never be overconfident. With the Lions. Also, in other news, Detroit unveiled 6 new murals along the Joe Louis Greenway between Warren Gateway Park and I-96. Business owners donated the wall space for the displays painted by local artists.
I will drive past there and look.
Yeah.
Coming up, Bangladeshi residents have long been around Metro Detroit. We'll discuss their migration patterns to the area in the first ever exhibit on Bangladeshi American heritage that's coming to the Hamtramck Historical Museum next month. Stay right there. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham.
I'm Sam Corey.
He's here.
I'm here.
He's here.
Right alongside
and alive.
you. In the studio.
In the studio. But just speaking of the next segment that we're going to introduce, the Bangladeshi community, like many other minority communities, began relocating to Michigan in waves. As early as the 1900s, a wave of Bangla Indians moved. In 1971, another one came after Bangladeshi gained independence. So how have Bangladeshi residents shaped Southeast Michigan, and how have they changed the way we operate in the world? In partnership with the Hamtramck Historical Museum, fiber artist Fatema Haque will help tell the story of Bangladeshi contributions next month at the Hamtramck Historical Museum. Joining us now to talk more about this first exhibit to explore Bangladeshi American heritage is Bangladeshi American fiber artist and exhibit committee member Fatema Haque. Fatema, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I love having conversations with you. You're just a wealth of knowledge. So, the relocation of Bangladeshis to Michigan in the early 70s, after gaining independence, I think about the importance of highlighting the identity of the folks coming over. And you talked a little bit about the different trades and diverse backgrounds from Bangladeshi. So if you can describe the folks who are coming over here and the waves that we're seeing, especially in the early 70s.
Yeah, so beginning in the 1970s, Bangladeshis began relocating to Michigan as skilled workers, as political refugees, sometimes religious refugees. There's also a large wave brought to America by the diversity visa lottery. And so a lot of people just applied because the U.S. had a policy of if they didn't have people from certain countries, they would open up a lottery system for them to enter and immigrate. So we saw a lot of different populations move in. In the 1970s, particularly, a lot of folks came to study in the area, whether it was to study engineering at Wayne State or U of M, the University of Michigan, or work in different sectors, particularly studying skilled workers like engineering and doctors. But with the diversity visa lottery winners, we saw much more range in terms of who had access. And so that included all sorts of people who came to the state. And they primarily moved to Michigan because there was already an existing connection or community available, and also because of affordable housing.
And Fatema, you talked a little bit about the existing community and the connection there. So when we see the diversity visa being implemented and we're starting to see more migration coming to Michigan, can you go into the Bangladeshi community that was already here and establishing itself, especially in Hamtramck?
Yeah, so there was a very small population in the 1970s. I had the chance to interview a few people as part of a previous project of mine who talked about how it was mostly men, very few families, and they did a variety of different jobs and lived together in a co-op-like housing with each other. But it was when they were able to establish permanent residency and apply for their families and reunite with them, that's when you really started to see more businesses pop up. You started to see mosques in the neighborhood, temples as well, for both Hindu as well as Buddhist populations. And you got to see more families in the area. And now, there's thousands, tens of thousands of folks.
Yeah. So, Fatema, there's 10 months of work that went into this exhibit. And what would be a normal timeline for you, and what's the significance about the time that was spent on this particular exhibit?
Yeah, so, I don't know what a normal timeline would be. Capturing any community's history is difficult work, and we in no way claim that this is everything that we could say about the community. It absolutely is not. But what we wanted to do was we really wanted to capture as much of the diaspora as we could. So we spent a lot of time brainstorming amongst ourselves. The committee was made up of mostly Bangladeshi American folks, and we talked about what's of importance to our community. What would we want people outside of the community to know? What would we want our children to know about Bangladesh specifically? So because we spent time with that, we wanted to talk about, Bangladesh is not despite being a small country, it's not a singular identity, right? There's so many regions and districts, and each district has its own culture and cuisine and sometimes even language. And Bengali, while spoken throughout the country, is not the only language spoken there. So we thought about the linguistic diversity that was at play. We also wanted to talk about, how do we connect all of this back to Hamtramck, to Metro Detroit, and where do these pieces land? So when we talked about religious and spiritual practices in Bangladesh, we connected it back to the establishment of mosques and temples in the area, as well as there's Christian Bangladeshis. So thinking about how can we represent the diverse religious practices in the community. So a lot of that went into that. We also spent time talking with members of the community and collecting artifacts from members of the community. And so, for example, the Michigan Buddhist community gifted a golden Buddha statue to be included in the exhibit. And a sitting Buddha statue represents, enlightenment and satisfaction within and peace and happiness. So we were hoping that people get a sense of all the different faiths in Bangladesh.
Yeah. Fatema, Sam here, you're talking a little bit about the religious influences that Bangladeshis have brought over to Southeast Michigan. I'm wondering if you could explore a little bit of the artistic, musical, food sort of influences, the way Bangladeshis have helped shape the culture here around Southeast Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. A big part of the exhibit is going to explore Bangladeshi folk art, including the fiber art. So things like jamdani fabric, as well as silk, Bangladeshi different types of silk. We have some examples of clay art as well as wood crafts and bamboo and cane work. So there's going to be a variety of art pieces available for folks to see and learn about. And we also will highlight local businesses that are Bangladeshi owned and operated. So we've created a database of all of the businesses in the Metro Detroit area, or as many as we could verify and document were Bangladeshi American owned. And this would allow you to see what's available, including restaurants, catering services, clothing shops, as well as just all sorts of things, travel businesses, healthcare businesses. And we're hoping that you really get to see the economic impact that Bangladeshis have made to the area. And if you, hopefully that would also lead you to a little bit of a tour of Hamtramck and the Metro Detroit area, and you'll find nice, interesting places to eat and visit. And we really hope that it would celebrate some of that local cuisine that's available.
If you're just tuning in, we're chatting with Fatema Haque, a fiber artist. We're chatting about a new exhibit this November highlighting the contributions of Bangladeshis in Metro Detroit, Bangladeshi Americans here in Metro Detroit. So, I think about both cities of Hamtramck and Warren have a large population of Bangladeshi Americans. Hamtramck itself has been trending conservative, and at least with its political leadership. And I'm wondering, to the best of your knowledge, broadly speaking, of course, what are some of the political values of Bangladeshi Americans in Southeast Michigan? I love that you talked about how there are different regions with different dialects and different foods and different cultures. So if you can, just talk about that in a broad way.
Yeah, I definitely think that, just like with any other communities, there's a diverse range of viewpoints in terms of politics and what folks are in support of. I think what many community members are looking for is to be heard, to be acknowledged, to see themselves taken into consideration when decisions are being made, and to see themselves represented, just as we all do. And I've heard a range of political perspectives, everything from Democratic to Republican, within the community. And I think, again, it's really just a matter of which candidate is actually taking the time to hear us, to speak to us, to, think about what our needs may be, and respond to that appropriately.
And one of my last questions to you, about 30 seconds or less, how do conversations about interpersonal connections with other people of color go, and how has those connections been able to form throughout Hamtramck, Detroit, Southeastern Michigan, where have you? And how do you expect exhibits like this one to help connect those bridges?
I really hope that people get to learn more about the community that they live in, and I sincerely hope that it generates interest as well as hopefully inspiration. We drew a lot of inspiration from the communities that already exist and that have their own spaces, showing their cultural histories, like the Ukrainian Association's space, and the Dearborn Arab American Museum. We thought about how wonderful it is that such things exist, and we learned about those communities, so we wanted to present ourselves. So I'm hoping that other communities who may not already have that space also feel inspiration to represent their culture so that others can learn about it.
Thank you so much, Fatema Haque, Bangladeshi American fiber artist and exhibit committee member. The exhibit opens November 2nd. It runs through May of 2025, and there will be opening November 3rd from 2 to 4 p.m. at the Hamtramck Historical Museum. Thank you so much, Fatema.
Thank you. Take care.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Have a great day.